coincide with a local festival, and managed to scale the walls and take control of most of the city before they were detected. The Carthaginian generals in charge retreated behind an inner wall, holding up in the citadel of the city. Another stalemate ensued. The Carthaginians attempted to relieve the city by sending a number of fleets, but a combination of foul weather and Roman interference kept most help away. To make matters worse, a plague swept across Italy in 211 BC, decimating the Carthaginian army looking for an opportunity to aid the Syracusans, and bringing those trapped inside to their knees. After being abandoned by the Carthaginian generals, those still holding out inside the city surrendered, and Marcellus claimed Syracuse for Rome. Then, in an uncharacteristic display of barbarism, with permission to haul off anything they could. It was in the course of this looting that Archimedes was killed. The sack of Syracuse shocked even the Romans, who still looked with reverence on the great Greek city, and were horrified to hear how poorly its citizens, art, and treasure had been treated. However, they were not so torn up that they did not celebrate an ovation for Marcellus upon his return to Rome. So we'll leave Rome on an upbeat this week, after ending the last two episodes with devastating Roman defeats. Even though they had lost the initiative in Spain, they had turned the situation in Sicily around and secured most of the island once again for Rome. Next week, we will return to Italy and trace the movement of Hannibal during these years, and follow the Romans as they followed Hannibal around, and flip back cities Hannibal had flipped to the Carthaginian cause. There were few out-and-out battles between the two armies, just a lot of territory swapping and internal political machinations between rival factions inside the Italian cities. We will also introduce next week young Scipio Africanus, who would take command of the situation in Spain and attempt to avenge his father's defeat there. Only 25 at the time, he was given the command at this unprecedented age, not because he displayed any great ability or seemed to be the savior of Rome, but rather because he was the only one who volunteered for the job. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 23D, The War with Hannibal. Last week, we detoured out of Italy to cover the Second Punic War and its two foreign theaters, Spain and Sicily. This week, we will return to Hannibal's march through Rome's backyard and attempt to distill 10 years of complicated allegiance switching, threats, revenge, and posturing into a single podcast. Well, actually half a podcast, because we must also return to Spain with young Scipio Africanus to pick up the ball where his father and uncle had left it. By the end of today, Scipio's ascendancy will intersect with Hannibal's slow decline, and the stage will be set for the final act of the Second Punic War, played out not in Italy as Hannibal planned, but in North Africa. But before we get to our two main focuses today, we need to detour into the third major foreign theater of the war. Though critically important to the war effort, the struggle with the Macedonians in the east has thus far received little attention, because for the most part it featured Greek allies fighting on behalf of Rome, rather than the Romans themselves, and also because the war in the east served mostly to keep Philip V out of the war, rather than unfolding as an integral part of that war. Though inextricably linked to the war with Hannibal, the First Macedonian War was, in many ways, a completely separate animal. It is important not so much in the context of the Second Punic War, but as a stage setter for the next 50 years of Roman history, which will revolve around the Roman conquest of Greece. Not long after Cannae, Hannibal and Philip V of Macedon signed a formal treaty with one another and pledged mutual support against each other's enemies. Philip was the young leader of a newly resurgent Macedon, who had visions of reuniting Greece under Macedonian rule, as his namesake Philip II, father of Alexander, had done. Rome, which had played no part in Philip II's calculations, now loomed large in Philip V's. The Romans were already entrenched in Illyria, and despite their claims of merely temporary occupation, they showed no signs of leaving. After the disaster at Cannae, Hannibal made formal overtures to the Macedonian king, and Philip accepted at once. The deal would leave Philip in control of Rome's eastern territory when Hannibal inevitably won the war, and provide Philip a steady Carthaginian supply line for his planned move against the rest of Greece. It also cemented a mutual sphere of influence that allayed both sides' fears of territorial encroachment. Deal in hand, Philip's envoys returned to Macedon, but on the way across the Adriatic, they were captured by the Roman navy. Immediately recognizing the danger of Hannibal's eastern alliance, Rome was forced to turn its already divided attention to one more front. But without troops to spare, they sent a scant force of about 2,000, with orders to not simply engage Philip, but instead to drum up Greek support for Rome and attempt to get the Greeks to fight Philip for them. This turned out to be easier than they thought. The Greeks were not happy in the slightest about Philip's ambitions, and despite their own prejudice against the barbaric Italians, they recognized the Romans for what they were, a force that could help blunt Macedon's influence. Specifically, Rome found a receptive audience in the Aetolian League, a confederation of cities that stood between Macedon and Greece proper. Knowing they would be among the first swallowed by Philip's territorial ambition, the Aetolians embraced Rome as their road both to continued independence and also possible dominance in a post-war Greece, and agreed to help counter Philip any way they could. The Macedonian king had his eye on driving the Romans out of their coastal garrisons in Illyria, so he could establish a port from which to launch attacks into Italy. The Aetolians agreed to launch incursions into Macedon every time Philip tried to turn west. So, whenever Philip left for Illyria, the Aetolians would begin making trouble. The 10-year War of Skirmishes is today, in the context of Roman history, called the First Macedonian War, but that makes more of it than it really was. It was the Second Macedonian War that really marked the first time the Romans moved east and fought the Greeks directly. Though it was not a direct engagement between the Romans and Macedonians, and won the Romans no territory, the battle in the east between the Macedonians and the Roman allied Greeks served the function it was meant to. It kept Philip out of the war with Hannibal. And this being the final upshot of all that fighting, we will leave it at that and return to the greater war at hand. One of the most important was the decision by the nobility of Capua, the second most important city in Italy, to defect to the Carthaginian side. Hannibal expected this defection to be followed by the rest of Italy, but it was not meant to be. Capua's alliance with the Carthaginians did not sway the rest of Italy, as Hannibal, and no doubt the Capuans themselves, hoped that it would. Rather than putting them in the vanguard of history, Capua actually found themselves immediately isolated and recognizing that they may have bought high on Hannibal's stock. Certainly Capua's experience for the rest of the war was not a happy tale of preparing to rule Italy with Carthaginian backing, but instead a sad tale of enduring a Roman siege, finally begging for forgiveness, and ultimately a whole lot of beheadings. But for now, it was all still sunshine and roses for Hannibal. With Capua in his back pocket, and Syracuse recently brought into the Carthaginian fold, Hannibal marched south to Magna Graecia with high hopes. The apex of Carthaginian momentum came in 212 BC, when Hannibal won control of the rich Greek port city of Tarentum. The pro-Roman party in the city was ousted by a group of young nobles, who handed the city over to the Carthaginians. The moment fortune turned against Hannibal was there at Tarentum when, as he marched into the city, the Roman garrison stationed there fought its way into the citadel and held it. The citadel at Tarentum was situated on the coast and could be supplied independently of the rest of the city. Hannibal was never able to dislodge the garrison, and so was denied a safe Italian port through which he could resupply his invasion force. This would prove critical down the road, as the Carthaginian Senate was loath to send supply ships and men to reinforce Hannibal when there was no guarantee they would even reach him. Up until Tarentum, almost nothing had gone against Hannibal. This was the first time things hadn't gone exactly according to plan. Annoyed by this thorn in his side, Hannibal's attention was forced back north to Capua, where his new ally was under siege by Roman forces. After Cannae, the Roman grand strategy abandoned any hope of taking on Hannibal directly. They had by now touched that hot stove enough to recognize that it burned. So, rather than sending an army south to confront Hannibal, they laid siege to Capua and attempted to flip them back to the Roman side instead. If any of you out there have ever played the ancient Chinese board game Go, you are probably familiar with the proverb, when in doubt, tanuki, which translates roughly, when in doubt, ignore your opponent. Good advice, and the Romans were wise to take it. By attacking Capua, the Romans forced Hannibal into a position where he was reacting to Roman moves, rather than the Romans reacting to his. Rome, for the first time in the war, held the initiative. Hannibal attempted to respond in kind to the Romans by embracing the concept of tanuki himself, and rather than making for Capua, he drove instead for the one city he had studiously avoided, Rome itself. In 211 BC, Hannibal marched within 2 miles of the city, the closest he would ever get to Rome, and waited for the Romans to fly into a panic, lift the siege at Capua, and come running home. But the Romans did not bite at the obvious gambit. They knew Hannibal's army was not nearly strong enough to take Rome by force, and so they only broke off a portion of their siege army to reinforce the city. Capua remained under arms and growing more desperate by the day. His bluff called, Hannibal was forced to withdraw. The pro-Carthaginian leadership of Capua, abandoned now by Hannibal, was overthrown by pro-Roman forces and the city surrendered. The penalties for treason were harsh, and the aforementioned beheadings commenced with bloody abandon. Though in typical Roman fashion, their fury was directed at the leadership, not the city as a whole, and the sanctions imposed on Capua were light compared to the stress their defection had put on the Roman war effort. One of the main reasons I began the history of Rome in the first place was to distill the often mind-numbing minutiae of the ancient historians into digestible chunks. Specifically, the middle years of the Second Punic War is a period that cries for summarization. Livy fills hundreds of pages detailing every lost city, every betrayal, every conversation with every political faction, and every minor skirmish. The information is out there for those of you who would like more detail, but I now offer with great relish a paragraph I have been kicking around in my head for the better part of a year. The experience of Capua and Tarentum was repeated ad nauseum over the next few years. Hannibal would take a city and then move on. The Romans would follow behind and return it to the Roman fold. Hannibal would then be forced to either backtrack and refight for land he had already taken, or give up what he had gotten and hope for better luck the next time around. The two armies occasionally came into direct contact. Sometimes Hannibal would win, sometimes the Romans would. But victory no longer took the form of annihilated armies, but rather strategic withdrawals and prudent retreats. In this way, 5 years passed. Beautiful. That said, I now want to shift gears and move out of Italy and back to Spain, where, after the defeat of the Scipione army, it looked for all the world as if the Romans would never regain their footing. Certainly, no Roman general was eager to take up the difficult task in Spain. All that remained in Iberia was the bare remnants of the defeated legions, a horde of Carthaginians and hostile Spanish tribes. Officially, Rome had no intention of giving up in Spain, but practically speaking, they were about to do just that. Into this leadership vacuum stepped a young man, Scipio